This morning we're talking about leadership. As we continue through the Gospel of Mark, leadership comes up over and over, specifically leadership of Jesus. And when we talk about leadership, it's hard to not talk about what we're going through today. Not just the two hurricanes that decided they wanted to come at the same time and bless us with their presence, and Louisiana now possibly with their presence. But when we talk about leadership, I can't help but think of COVID. When you look at COVID, it threw so much that was the standard, if you will, upside down. And leaders across the board, not just corporately, but leaders in the church, we had to adapt. We had to, I love the way one person says, you have to pivot in the leadership because you can't do the things that were always the standard. And when I say always, I mean for the last 30, 40, 50, 60 years, right? Not since the beginning of time. And it's amazing because as leadership struggled to adapt across the nation, we've seen some pretty neat and innovative things come out of it. We've been reminded by the adaptation of the leadership and the pivoting, if you will, of leadership. We've been reminded that the way things have been done in our lifetime doesn't mean that's the only way that they're able to be done. We realize that you can use Zoom for so much more than just saying hi to Grandma and Grandpa. We all realized we should have bought stock in Zoom a long time ago, whenever it was cheap. But we learned a lot. But it caused a growth not just for us, generally speaking, but for all leaders. Leaders had to grow. They had to get outside of comfort zones. They had to make changes and weren't quite sure how those changes would go. Here at this congregation, we made several changes, as you know, just like every other congregation. We had to forego meeting for a time for the health of everyone involved. And so we had to figure out, well, how do we do that? So we had to start putting together different online worship experiences, which kind of is an interesting concept in and of itself. But nevertheless, we had to try to figure that out. And then we had to figure out, well, how do we add the song service in it without opening ourselves up to a lawsuit? Because just because you're a church doesn't mean people don't want to sue you, right? And so we have to legally go about that. So it took 2, 3, 4 weeks, I don't remember, before I found something and we figured out how we could legally publish that music that we had on Sunday mornings. And then we had to figure out, okay, well, how do we incorporate this other stuff? And then we had to figure out, well, what do we do for Wednesday nights? Because we can't meet, so let's figure out this Zoom thing. And then that was a learning curve for most of us in here, right? And then we had to figure out, well, how do we care for people when we can't even go into their home and we can't even go into the hospital room with them? Whether it's our family, whether it's the church family, whether it's friends, how do we care for them? You see, we had to pivot. We had to adapt and kind of figure out how we do all these things that we'd just taken for granted. And suddenly, some of the stuff that was an issue became a non-issue for us, right? Because we were so focused on navigating the new together. And I think in many ways it has helped because, I don't know about you, but one thing I've noticed as I've watched after worship service is how many people stick around longer now because we've just been so much away from each other. And you see, when we talk about leadership is something that we all have. It's something that we all do. We just do it to varying degrees. If you have children, you're a leader. If you have grandchildren, you're a leader. If you go to a job, you're a leader. If you have friends, you lead at least one of those friends, even if you don't know it. We all experience leadership. And Jesus teaches us a lot of different things about leadership in Mark, even though we're just going to focus on a few of those this morning. And so if we want to lead, as the saying goes, we need to lead like Jesus, don't we? If we're going to lead, we don't need to do it just kind of casually, but we need to be intentional and lead like Jesus. And Jesus gives us several lessons in leadership found in the book of Mark in chapter 3. The first lesson in leadership that we learn from Jesus is that Jesus put people first. He put people above everything else. Not the mission of God, but the mission of God was people, by the way. He put people above his own needs and his own desires. He put people above tradition. He put people above expectations of himself. He put people first. His heart went out to others. He loved to put people before himself and before what was often expected by the Pharisees and Sadducees. Mark chapter 3, in the first 5 verses, it says, "And he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him." Now, if you were with us on Wednesday night, we talked about this idea that they were nitpickers. All they wanted to do was accuse. They wanted to find something wrong because they didn't like him. So the Pharisees were watching to find something wrong. In verse 3 it says, "And he said to the man with the withered hand, 'Come here.' And he said to them," that is the Pharisees, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm? To save life or to kill?" But they were silent, and he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. And he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." You see, back then, the Pharisees and Sadducees, they were looking for anything to pin him to the wall, if you will. Literally, it was pin him to the cross. But they were looking for anything and everything. And they were, with a fine-tooth comb, going through everything he does. And so Jesus used an opportunity to teach that humans are more important than the expectations that are ungodly. They're more important than the traditions that go beyond what God had given to them. As he's still, once again, in the Sabbath. We talked about in Mark, we often see Jesus doing things on the Sabbath. He understood the priority people have in the heart of God. This prioritized his ministry objectives. It prioritized what he taught and what he did. Even when it went against the cultural expectations, he did what was right in God's eyes rather than going with the crowd. It would have been easy for Jesus to say, "Come back tomorrow and I'll heal you," any of the times that he did it. He didn't say, "Come back tomorrow." He said, "Come here," because he prioritized people. He wanted to do what God asked of him. People first means we seek to bring healing and encouragement to others. I love Galatians 5, verse 13. "For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." People first. Through love serve one another. You see, leaders are those who serve. We're going to get into what serving looks like and doesn't look like as we go, but the ultimate idea of service as a leader is you lead for the better of those you're leading, not for your own well-being. This is the heart of shepherding, isn't it? A shepherd protects the flock. A shepherd doesn't abuse the flock. A shepherd doesn't do these other horrible things that we see in Scripture talked about, right? That the hired hand, if you will, does. A shepherd protects. A shepherd watches over the flock. A shepherd pulls them out when they're caught in a thorn bush. When they break a leg, the shepherd picks them up and brings them back to the fold. When one is lost, the shepherd goes and they find them. Why? Because leaders are servants. They love the people they serve. And Jesus put people first. And church, that is our calling, is to put people first. The reason we put people first is not because we get something out of it from the person, but because Jesus himself did it. This goes really in line with our mission statement. If you look on the back of your bulletin, we have a mission statement, a purpose statement. A church committed to spreading hope. People first, isn't it? We want to give hope to people. Renewing purpose. People first, isn't it? We want to give them a purpose that's greater than just whatever the world is tossing at them. And a church committed to engaging our community. People first, right? Spreading hope, renewing purpose, engaging our community. That is people first mentality. Just like Christ. we are called Christians. Christians means Christ-like. So as we lead others, whether we're leading in a corporation, whether we're leading in the church, whether we're leading in a family, we put people first and we follow the example of Christ. But the next thing Jesus teaches us in chapter 3 is that, well, Mark teaches us about Jesus, I suspect. Jesus inspired people. And as leaders, we are to inspire them as well. And we are to encourage them. We are to drive them to be better, to do better, to achieve greater things. Inspiring them to be more than just okay. Leaders are contagious, aren't they? Good leaders are contagious. They inspire people to do greater things. Mark 3, verses 7 through 8 says, Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea, and a great crowd followed from Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem and Idumea, and from beyond the Jordan and from around Tyre and Sidon. When the great crowd heard all that he was doing, they came to him. He was inspiring. People wanted to be around him. He was contagious, if you will. People wanted to know what was going on. They not only wanted themselves to be healed, but as we saw with the paralytic, others wanted to bring their friends to be healed by Christ. No matter where he went, crowds followed him, even to the point that he asked the disciples to get a boat so that he wouldn't be crushed by the crowds that were pressing up against him, and to the point that those who were struggling, those who were sick, those who had demons, they would just want to touch him so that they might be healed. And crowds would follow him and hang off of every word that he spoke. Jesus inspired people. He inspired people to go against the cultural norm of their day and to live a life of godliness. He continues to inspire people to go against the norms of the day and live a life of godliness. He inspired people that they are called to not please man, but to please God. And God is the first one they please, because God is the one that matters. And in pleasing God, one retains, if you will, their salvation, for they will do the right things. You see, Jesus inspired people, not just through his words, but through his example, didn't he? He inspired people by showing us how to live, how to handle temptation, how to live a pure and holy life, how to interact with those who need compassion, how to interact with those who are just trying to find something wrong with them, how to interact with all of these, with government officials. Jesus shows us. He doesn't just speak it, but he shows us in his own life and inspires us to follow suit, or at least I hope he continues to inspire us. As Christians, as leaders, do we strive to inspire others as Christ inspired us? Do we strive to challenge others to do greater things? Not just academically, but spiritually. Do we strive as leaders, as Christians, to encourage them to see who they have been made to be and what they can obtain? This idea of, there was, I think it was my generation, maybe a little bit before me, maybe a little bit after me, I don't know, but this idea of you can be anything you want. I'm telling you, you can't. I mean, literally, no one is talented in every single... I could not be a heavyweight boxer. I got the heavyweight down, but I'm too short. I could not be a point guard for the Chicago Bulls. They're all giants. I'm not even as tall as Scottie Pippen, I don't think. But God has created us to be something great. As leaders, are we helping people discover that? And are we driving them towards that and inspiring them and encouraging them to achieve what that might be? To be better, to grow deeper spiritually, to grow closer with God, and to accomplish the mission of God. Are we leading people to be inspired so that they might inspire others? The third thing that we learn and we see is that Jesus made people better. Now, this is closely tied to what we just talked to, but Jesus made people better. Health-wise, spiritually, and every other way. He made people better. Mark chapter 3, verse 9 and 10 says, He told His disciples to have a boat ready for Him because the crowd, lest they crush Him. For He had healed many, so that all who had diseases pressed around Him to touch Him. Jesus sought to make people both spiritually and physically better. We do that as well. John Maxwell is a leadership guru, if you will, for the not just religious world, but even the corporate world. John Maxwell talks about this with his idea to add value. And he says every day he wakes up and his question is, how can I add value to people today? Isn't that a great thought? Rather than what can I find wrong with you, what can I do to add value to you? What do you think the world would change if Christians woke up every morning and saying, I'm going to add value to this world. I'm going to add value to everybody I come in contact with. Wouldn't the world change greatly, I think? I think it would make a huge impact because Jesus Himself, He sought to make people better. He sought to add value to others. And this drove others to be inspired and come to Him. Church, we are to leave a lasting impact, a lasting impression in the positive nature on the lives of others because it makes them better. It brings them closer to Christ. It adds value, not just to them, but to the kingdom of God and to the mission and purpose and testimony of Christ. Philippians 2, verse 4 says, Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but look to the interest of others. Are we making others better? Are we adding value to their life, encouraging them? We all lead someone. As we lead, how are we making people better? When you leave here today, those that you have interaction with, how did you add value in that conversation to them? Because this was what Jesus sought to do. And finally, Mark teaches us that Jesus invested in a team. Jesus invested in a team. In 13 through 16, and He went up to the mountain and called to Him those whom He desired, and they came to Him. And He appointed 12, whom He also named apostles, so that they might be with Him, and He might send them out to preach and have authority to cast out demons. He appointed the 12. Did you catch that? He called to Him those whom He desired. You see, as leaders, when you lead in whatever capacity you lead in, you don't just take anyone and everyone to be a, quote, disciple, if you will, to learn and follow. You choose those who are going to fulfill the mission. That's what Jesus did. He said these 12, they don't look like leaders to this world that He lived in, but He could see their potential. And He chose them, and He groomed them, and He developed them. He added value to them, and He sent them to carry out His ministry so that they might teach those who would come after Him, which includes you and I, how to fulfill the ministry as well. It's the same with us, isn't it? Whenever you run a company, if you have a large company that has, let's say, 3,000 employees, and you're the CEO, can you spend time with 3,000 people and add value to each of their lives? But you can spend time with a board or with 12, 14. You can spend time with a handful that then can spend time with a handful that then can spend time with a handful. And that, I mean, it sounds like a pyramid scheme, doesn't it? But the truth is, that's how leadership is done, isn't it? It's amazing how he invested in his team, how he assembled that team, and he assembled a great team around him, a team that even those in the team didn't like some of the other ones coming into the team, right? It's like, Jesus, are you serious? You know he's a tax collector. The Jews hate him and the Romans hate him. Nobody likes this guy. But you're calling him in? Come on. Jesus assembled the team around him. The team was trained and then delegated to. As leaders, we have to delegate. If we don't ever delegate, we are not doing our job. This is one of the things that if you're in charge of a ministry, one thing I tell everyone that talks to me about how do I do this, how do I do that, is if you're in charge of ministry, you don't have to do everything. Delegate. You can't do everything. Delegate. If you're an elder, delegate. If you're a deacon, delegate. Don't delegate everything to the point you don't do nothing, but you get the drift, right? We can accomplish so much more when we form a team and we utilize that team around us. That's what Jesus did. But Jesus didn't expect what he didn't inspect. I just want to put that out there. Church, we are called to be leaders. In fact, the leaders in this church are not just the elders and the ministers. You know how I know that? I don't have this on the slides, but if you go look in Ephesians chapter 4, I believe it starts in verse 11 or 12, it talks about God gave the shepherds and the evangelists and the teachers and all these people. He gave them not to do the work themselves, but church, what does he say he gave them for? We know this. To what? Do we not know this? To equip the saints for the ministry. That's you. Whenever I would go on interviews for preaching and stuff over the years, even youth ministry, when I was a youth minister, one of the things that's common among a lot of churches is they want to hire you, the minister, the youth minister, the worship minister, whatever it is, to do everything. And that's not scriptural, church. In fact, that's unscriptural. Because then you're not allowing the elders and the deacons and the ministers and the teachers, you're not allowing them to fulfill the calling God gave to them, which is to equip, not to do it all, but to equip you. But I think that's because we don't often see ourselves as leaders if we're not an elder or a deacon or a minister or a teacher. We forget that we are leaders out there in various ways and in various roles. I said this the other day. I like the way I said it the other day better because I don't remember how it was, but it sounded great at the time. And that is, guys, what we do here, our classes, our worship services, yes, our worship goes to God, I get that, but what we do here, this is the training ground for what you've been called to do out there. That means when Josh preaches a lesson and we look at Mark 3, or we teach a class on Mark 3, that means that's not all there is to get out of that. So go home, look, read, study some more, go deeper. Because that's where you're going to get the richness. So leaders follow the example of Christ, and they do at least these 4 things. They put other people first. They inspire others. They make others better. And they invest in and delegate to others. In church, we are all leaders in one way or another. We all lead somebody. To be fair, I lead my dog, apparently. I can't get away from the thing. But all dogs go to heaven, so I'm not worried about that. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you haven't seen the movie. Guys, we are all leaders. If we're going to lead, let's lead intentionally. If we're going to lead, let's follow the example of Christ. Christ leads us so that we might lead others in a walk with Him. Let's go to God in prayer. Father, thank you so much for